Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 371 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's podcast episode is on what influences driving behaviour. And it is Saturday, the 7th of March 2026 as I record this. So today's podcast episode is a lot of fun, it's really insightful, and it really gets you thinking. Because when it comes to driving, we just tend to get in the car, we tend to drive along, and that's it. That's about as much thought as we actually give it. But in reality, there's a wide range of different psychological processes happening at the same time as we're driving. Because there's cognitive processes, social psychology processes, there's intergroup processes, there's emotional processes, and even there's personality factors that are going on here. Because your personality can also impact your driving. Therefore, by the end of this podcast episode, you're going to learn about a wide range of the different psychological processes that are involved in driving. For example, how does conscientiousness, how does agreeableness, what about extroversion, how do those personality factors impact driving, but also how do our inter-group processes, for example, road rage, what's the psychology behind road rage, and also navigating the road, autopilot, and so many other brilliant psychological processes which I flat out loved. This is a really engaging, detailed podcast episode that I flat out love to put into together for all of you. So you're definitely going to learn a lot in the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section, we're going to be reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one is, parenthood inoculates against disgust, but only after weaning. Feelings of disgust help us to stay clear of vomit, feces, and other potential harbingers of infection. But as anyone who has ever changed a nappy knows, only too well, parenthood makes these things impossible to avoid. Researchers from the University of Bristol wondered whether this prolonged exposure to bodily waste might actually change a parent's disgust-free response. In their paper in the Scandinavian Journal of Psychology, they report that indeed it does. Parenthood seems to be an inoculation against the disgust, though only after the baby has reached a critical turning point. So, personally, yes, but I am not good when it comes to changing diapers, doing any of the more disgusting side of looking after children, because it's not nice. I'm not made for it at all. And I remember when I used to work at a special needs school, and I had to read the personal care policy. I was horrified. I was quite disgusted, and I was like, no, please tell me I'm never actually going to have to do this for a child. The child that I'm in charge of, but they're not my child. And no, I had a lot of issues about that. Thankfully, I never had to do that. But, yeah, changing diapers, fecal matter, vomit, no, I'm just not good at it. I also remember when I used to live in Canterbury, one of my housemates was violently sick once, and we were comforting them, we were supporting them in the bathroom whilst they were being sick. They were really scared and everything. But when they started throwing up, I had to leave the room because I was like, I'm not dealing with this. No, no, I do not like it at all. So my entire point of those little anecdotes was that this is perfectly normal. Lots of people flat out hate anything to do with vomit, fecal matter, and other potential harbingers of infection. But when it comes to parenthood, you really have got to deal with it. Like, if my child actually needed their nappy changed if they were sick and stuff, of course, I would push through my disgust because I love my child. I would want to see support them, and one day I would actually quite like to have a child of my own. But I also understand the idea that you only become inoculated against the disgust when the baby has reached a certain critical point. Because I think that if you've got a newborn baby, or if your baby is only a few months old, then you are going to want to be hyper vigilant to different sources of infection, because you don't want your baby to be sick because they're still new, but they're developing. Their immune system is still developing and growing. So you're going to want to avoid potential harbingers of an infection, and I love that saying for some reason. So that's definitely something to think about. Therefore, I think if we apply this psychology news article, I think that this is just something to be aware of. I cannot think of any practical implications except just thinking about our own mindset and our own opinions and attitudes towards the disgust and parenthood. But it was a fun article, and the BPS Research Digest has this photo of a baby covered in spaghetti. Now, that I don't find disgusting because it's a kid playing with their food, and it's about sensory play, it's about exploring different textures and stuff, but trying to clean this up would probably be a nightmare. So I feel sorry for that parent or whoever has to tidy up after the photo's been taken. So the second one is new study highlights the day-to-day importance of autistic flow. Flow state is typically described as feeling the time falling away as we become absolutely absorbed in an activity. For autistic people, this kind of a deep immersion, autistic flow, can be especially intense. And new research suggests important day-to-day functioning. Writing in counseling and psychotherapy research, researchers show that the flow is not just a pleasurable, but plays a critical role in self-regulation, influencing how autistic people manage emotions, cope with overwhelm, and engage with the world. Now, I completely agree with this because this has actually just reminded me in my next bunch of podcast episodes, which I'll be doing for the next month ahead. I've got to do a psychology episode on flow states, mainly because of curling. Because during the Winter Olympics, I was watching like curling quite a bit. And a lot of the different Winter Olympians do talk about the like flow state. So I do want to talk about it. But I flat out hate with an utter passion being interrupted when I'm doing something. Mainly because this autistic flow state, because I really enjoy my stuff, or like the stuff I do, whether it's psychology, business, writing, etc. I do not like to be interrupted. I really like getting immersed in the topic. I like doing it, and I hate being interrupted. I get quite annoyed because like you're just interrupting my flow, you're stopping me from enjoying it, and you're taking me out of it, and you're stopping my pleasure. So that's something that I've got a major issue with. That's why I do not like being interrupted. But also, autistic flow state, I can understand from my personal experience here why it's important to like self-regulate. Why flow state helps us to manage emotions, cope with overwhelm, and engage with the world. Because I tend to find that if I'm in my flow state, if I'm doing something that I really enjoy and I'm allowed to get quite deep into it, then I feel better afterwards. I'm more sociable, sort of recharges my social battery to some extent because I've been alone and now I'm sort of recharged enough to go out into the wider world. Of course, that's just my egg experience, and the massive A applied finding from this article, I would say, is about threefold. So, first of all, for our own general A awareness, it's important that we decide and if we allow all autistic individuals just to be in their flow state. If you can see that they're really deeply engaged, and if there's no urgency, do not bring them out of their flow state. So that's my first tip. Secondly, I would say that if you're doing some sort of systemic work, whether this is with a family system, a school based intervention, or something, I would actually encourage those individuals to enable the autistic person to enter a flow state, just so they can get the inner enjoyment, so they can self regulate, manage their emotions, cope with overwhelm, and engage more adaptively with the world. So, yep, and this might involve some sort of psychoeducation about the importance of the autistic flow state is how to enable the child or the other autistic person to be able to cope with that better. And finally, you might be seeing an autistic child, an autistic adult, and they might need some sort of self-regulation techniques. It's something that you might want to work with them on. And of course, everything on this podcast is not official advice in the slightest, but you might want to work on with them to see if they allow themselves to go into the flow state, if they allow themselves like that a freedom, or do they mask and not allow themselves to get that deep in a pleasurable task? It's just something to think about. So the last one is, what is it like to live with alopecia? And please know, because of my dyslexia, I do not know how to say that word, so that is my best guess. Alopecia? That might be better. So this is a term that covers several types of hair loss, which ranges in a appearance from patchiness to complete bodily baldness. Many people with the condition find it distressing, and it's known to increase the risk of depression, anxiety, as well as quality of life. Despite how closely linked appearance can be with mental health, a comprehensive understanding of how affected people feel about their condition and how they cope with it has been lacking. In a bid to address this gap, researchers from the University of Cardiff and colleagues poured over 22 studies on a total of 990 people living with the condition, looking for overarching experiences of their life. And I will just read one paragraph from the write up. The first theme was Who Am I Without Hair? Participants across the studies described the loss of hair as deeply traumatic, even akin to losing a limb. They also found that hair loss dehumanized them and made them feel unattractive and stigmatized. There were physical challenges too. People who lost eyelashes and eyebrows repeated more sweat and dust getting into the eye, causing irritation and even leading them to avoid exercise. Okay, so my thoughts on this article is I didn't know that there was a condition that could cause you to lose all hair on your body. And there are a few different aspects that I want to take this. So, first of all, I think this is awful and really quite astounding because I know that my hair and I flat out hate male pattern baldness, especially when the hairline tends to recede as you get older. And because I've got my dad's genes, if I wasn't on finasteride and minoxidil, which are these two medical treatments, my hair would be a lot thinner and my hairline would be a lot further back because it was before I started these two medical treatments. And it was just like, I really do understand certain parts of this because, like, you do feel unattractive, you do feel really weird, but equally, I can't imagine what it's like to lose your eyelashes, to lose your eyebrows, because to some extent, that's what we associate with being human. Like, it's one of the ways how we recognize people. And if you see someone without eyebrows, then you are naturally going to think, oh, they look a bit strange. They look a bit weird. So that's a massive, massive a shame. And then you've also got the pain, the irritation of the sweat getting into the eyes and just stuff like that. And like, it's absolutely awful. And I'm doing a lot of research, a lot of writing up on chronic illness for the past week and a bit. And it really does impact people's lives. And some people just, what you really need is this sort of awareness, this psychoeducation. You need to, these people need actual psychological therapy because, yes, this might be a biological condition and a medical condition, but medical professionals, they aren't trained to look at the social factors, the psychological factors. They aren't equipped or to be knowledgeable about doing systemic interventions, individual psychotherapy, and changing people's thought processes to be more adaptive, more self compassionate, and accepting. So, to be honest, because I'm quite astounded by this article and that there is a condition like this, because I would flat out hate this, this would be extremely distressing for me because I do not want to be bald. That's one of my worst fears because no, I just do not want it at all. So I would say that yes, this article is definitely an awareness article, but equally, this does just highlight the importance of psychologists, mental health professionals, and other people in physical health assessments. So, just something to think about. So, I hope you enjoy the psychology news section. So, let's move on to the personal update. So, moving on to the personal update. So, this week has been real mixture and really a lot of fun because I've been doing lots of different like psychology projects, getting a lots of different books. Books are ready to be released and just chipping away and a lot of different projects and applying for more jobs. And I forgot that when it comes to jobs, there are so few jobs out there. And I've also been looking into the unemployment statistics across the UK. So the current unemployment statistic is about 5%. When it comes to young people, that rises to about 15%. So 15% of 20 to 24-year-olds are unemployed, which I think is horrific. And I will be trying to do a podcast episode at some point on the psychological impacts of unemployment. Because even though I'm not experiencing them too much, it's still something that I'm mindful of. It's still something that I'm thinking about. And I know that this does impact a lot of people. And because of the war going on in Iran, and yes, this is not a political show, I know that unemployment could actually just skyrocket because I know that in inflation's are going to start going up and lots of other negative economic factors. And these do impact real people, these do impact mental health. So if I can help people, and if I can provide them with a bit of knowledge and a bit of a few tips and tricks to help them cope with unemployment or whatever, then this might be really useful, and I want to do it. So, but that's one thing. Secondly, I had some amazing news this week that I'm so happy about. Okay, so for our international audience, so our National Health Service a few years ago introduced a scheme called Right to Choose. And this is basically when, instead of the National Health Service being in charge of your health care, or if you wanted a specific procedure done, a referral done, etc., then you were allowed to choose your healthcare provider that was partnered with the National Health Service, and you could request your doctors to refer you to them instead of the NHS. So, I suddenly realised this last week when I was in bed and I was thinking about autism diagnoses and how I would really love to be diagnosed as autistic just so I could get that protection in the workplace. Because as I keep going into work, being officially autistic, even though I hate that term with an utter passion, being officially autistic and being able to say to people, I'm autistic, I'm sorry if I do this and you don't like it, it's not me being difficult, arrogant, or blunt or horrible. It's because I'm autistic. And there are some people who flat out do not care that I'm autistic at work, but some people do. And for me, being able to have those legal protections under the Equality Act, whilst it's still legal in the UK, but this is not a political show, would be really useful. So I went on the line, I read about how the right to choose worked, and I found this a provider. So I emailed my doctor's surgery, and finally this week they referred me to this private company. So instead of the National Health Service taking between 5 to 7 years for an autism diagnosis, I might be able to get diagnosed within 3 months, which I would flat out love. And I'm so excited to finally possibly be diagnosed with autism. Because to me, that would just be amazing. And I did the NHS referral about 2 years ago, and of course, I've not heard anything. So, this autism diagnosis would probably happen in another 5 years. I don't want to wait that long, so thankfully the right to choose scheme might mean that I'm able to get this diagnosis a lot sooner, and that would be amazing and really affirming for me. So I just wanted to share that idea, in case there were any UK listeners who will want a diagnosis of any mental health condition, and they don't want to wait for the NHS, because as brilliant as the NHS is, it does take a while, and sometimes you really can't wait that long at all, and that's really not good. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can just email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment on the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi Whiteley. Leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. As always, I love to hear from all of you. It really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And please send pictures of where you're listening from. I always love to see what all of you are all over the world. And today's episode has been sponsored by Personality, Psychology, and Individual Differences. I am so excited that I'm able to promote this book because in today's podcast episode we do look at personality factors. We do look at how does your personality impact your behavior in the real world. So this great, really passionate, easy to understand book helps you to understand what is your personality, how is it measured, what are the big 5 personality traits. So, conscientiousness, agreeableness, openness to experiences, extroversion, and there's another one. Oh, and neuroticism. So, those are the big 5, but also What other personality psychology models are there? Like you've got the Hexa model, which I actually prefer because it's a brilliant, it's more holistic, and it's a more well-rounded approach to personality. But this book also understands how does a personality impact our behavior? How does it impact our religion? How does it impact our personality? How does it impact our academic outcomes? And so many more brilliant facets that I flat out love. I'm really passionate about this book because personality psychology, it was so much fun to learn about at university, and that passion, that interest really does come through in this book. So that's personality psychology and individual differences. Available from all major ebook retailers, you can order the paperback and hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you requested. And if you want the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence, then now you can at selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and Barnes& Noble, and selected library systems like Overdrive and Biblioteca. So, whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons. Your support shows that you like the show and you want to continue. So, if you wanted to become a patron of the show and get access to over 90, or to be honest, it's probably closer to 100 exclusive blog posts which won't be made into podcast episodes for weeks, months, or even years, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology Web podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Con Wiley. So that's enough for the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what influences driving behavior, the psychology of driving. So this podcast episode was so much fun. It's really insightful, engaging, and I loved putting this together for you. So let's dive into it. And as always, the content part of today's episode is narrated using my AI voice clone from 11 Labs. So let's dive into it, and I will see you on the other side. Why is understanding driving behavior important? Psychologists, policymakers, and other professionals need to understand what drives our behavior behind the wheel, because if we could understand the minds of drivers and understand why road rage happens, why we don't remember certain parts of journeys, and what happens when we're distracted, then this can help us to create safer, more efficient roads that can save lives, decrease stress, and make our lives easier. In addition, driving psychology isn't a brand new subdiscipline of psychology. Instead, we can trace the roots of driving psychology back to the earliest days of the automobile, because ever since we started travelling in horseless carriages, psychologists have been interested in the mental processes occurring when we drive. This changed and became more important in the 1920s, when as researchers shifted their focus towards understanding what happens in the driver's seat. They wanted to make sense of the cognitive processes that happen when humans meet machines. Personally, I really wanted to learn about the psychology of driving because I understand what Mae Martin was talking about after they were passed their test. Being able to drive is a lot more freeing, it builds your confidence, and it does open up a lot of opportunities for you. I never ever thought I would be able to drive because of my, at the time, undiagnosed dyspraxia that impairs their driving. It took me 4 times to pass my test. I couldn't understand the clutch, and I was not a bad driver or learner by any stretch. But for me, driving was immensely stressful. Nonetheless, over time, as I practiced more, I relaxed and finally passed. I would actually say that my mental health also experienced a positive increase. I could do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. I didn't need to be dependent on parents for lifts. I could go out with my friends and family whenever, and driving is just a lot easier for everyone. But what are the social, emotional, and cognitive processes that happen behind the wheel? That's the focus of the rest of this podcast episode. How do emotions impact driving? To help us start diving into the psychology of driving, I think we should start with emotions, because driving is a very emotional experience, not only because of the anxiety, the frustration of traffic, and the stress of being late to work. Yet, road rage, honking horns, and people swearing at each other on the road are very common, and we always tend to think about the emotional side of driving. There's always one or two stories a week from my dad about some idiot on the road. Anyway, to ease us into looking at how our emotions impact driving, anxiety as well as stress impact our driving behaviour, because these heightened emotional states can cause poor decision making, panic reactions, and aggressive driving. This increases the risk of accidents and crashes because our cognitive processes are not as effective as usual. More on cognition and driving in the next section. This is one of the reasons why, even though holy Google Maps says my journey to work is only 25 minutes in the morning, I always leave an hour or an hour and a quarter before work starts. This means I can just relax, listen to my music, and decrease the pressure on myself when driving. In terms of a driving risk, one of the reasons why I enjoy having a small car is because it allows me to fit through small gaps. Therefore, our sense of risk can impact our driving behavior, because when a person is confident as well as happy, they are more likely to take chances on the road and or speed. On the other hand, when a person is feeling sad or anxious, they are less likely to do this. Instead, an anxious and sad person is likely to be hesitant and overly cautious on the road. It reminds me when I was in sixth form, this is one of our 16 to 18-year-old education options in the United Kingdom. Me and my psychology class were talking with our teacher. Someone in the class had just passed their test, and she was saying that she was really anxious on the roads. Granted, this was only because she was a new driver. My psychology teacher explained that, that's good, because her anxiety about driving would make her more cautious, so she'd be less likely to have an accident. I'm not sure I agree with that 100%, but it is a kind thing to say, because I sometimes think overly cautious driving can be just as dangerous as speeding based on some of the situations I've seen in my experience. When it comes to road rage, this is the psychological state where our driving frustration boils over into aggression. Road rage is a complex interplay of factors like a sense of anonymity, perceived slight and stress. And the interesting thing about road rage, it only really happens in a car or other form of vehicle. If someone steps in front of you when you're walking, you might roll your eyes, sigh, or tut. But if someone slips into the lane in front of you in a car, then you're more likely to experience rage. Maybe it's something to do with the increased its perceived danger of driving, accidents, and the sheer amount of money damage it might cost you. On the whole, I've mentioned this a lot in the clinical psychology focused episodes, but developing emotional regulation techniques can be a useful tool to help you drive safely. For example, positive self-talk, breathing and listening to calming music can help you to keep your emotions regulated and focus on the road. On a final personal note for this section, even though no one would ever agree with me that this is relaxing music, it's one of the reasons why I have a playlist full of the Demon Slayer music. In fact, as I write this section, I've been listening to a song called Demon Slayer Rengoku Theme, Epic Version, Rengoku Ninth Form. It's just music that relaxes me, gives me background noise, and helps me to focus on the road and whatever else I am doing. This is even more important if I've had a difficult day at work, I've got a lot on my mind, and I simply need the drive to and from work to relax me. I would link the importance of knowing about how emotions impact driving with clinical and educational psychology, but they are very similar to the applications I give in the next section. How do our brains navigate the road? Whenever you get into a car for the first time, I think we can all admit that driving in an urban area is just scary. There are so many cars, people and bumps in the road that we are scared to hit. We are panicking about not hitting them, controlling our speed, and focusing on the other 10,000 things that we need to do as the drivers. Yet, how do our brains navigate the road? When it comes to navigating the road, our perception and attention of our environment is flat out critical for safe driving. If you have bad perception or poor attention, then honestly you are a danger on the road, since good perception and attention allows our brains to focus on the critical details when driving, like when a car in front suddenly brakes for no reason, or when a seagull suddenly lands in the middle of the road and there are no cars behind you, so you brake. Although our brains need to strike a careful balance, because if our brains focus too much on the details, then we can easily become overwhelmed and distracted by the sheer amount of things to focus on. This is where autopilot comes in, because if you're a driver, then you must have had moments that you suddenly realized that you've been driving without being consciously thinking about it. Autopilot is a phenomenon that highlights the potential dangers and efficiency of our cognitive processes. Personally, when it comes to autopilot, motorways or highways for you Americans is a major area for me. I can be driving down the M2, listening to my Demon Slayer music, and suddenly realize I have not been paying attention for a good 5 or 10 minutes because driving on a motorway is so easy. Yet I would add that one place I have, and hopefully will not be on autopilot, is on country lanes near where I used to work, because you really need to pay attention to make sure a car isn't six going to fly round a blind corner, crash into you and injure you. Another cognitive process involved in driving is our memory, because this allows us to recall routes, the meaning of traffic signs, road rules, and we can draw on our past experiences to help our current driving. A general example of this is our procedural memory allows us to drive to a familiar place without consciously thinking about it. Our brain does this to free up cognitive resources. Personally, an example of my using past knowledge to inform current driving is on the way to the place I used to work. At our finish time, there was always an annoying van parked outside the village shop, and because it was a village, this was the only main road, so all the traffic in the village would stop because of this one silly van on a corner. I needed to use my memory either to make sure I slowed down earlier because of the van and traffic, or I remembered to turn left at the roundabout outside work to avoid the van and traffic. Sadly, I sometimes forgot to turn left. Another cognitive process involved in driving is decision making, because whenever we're driving, we're making hundreds of little decisions in the blink of an eye, from predicting the movement of other drivers, calculating vehicle distance, and doing a pros and cons analysis before we take an action where a single mistake could be fatal or cost us a lot of money to repair. Finally, I want to wrap up this cognitive section on driving by mentioning that I understand a lot of people think we can multitask, but in reality, humans cannot multitask. When we multitask, what is actually happening is our brain is switching our cognitive processes and redirecting them towards their different tasks. This is why, when we're on the phone and driving, something you should never ever do, our performance suffers because instead of focusing on the road, our cognitive processes are directed towards talking on the phone. Linking these cognitive processes to clinical psychology, I would argue, whilst there are not a lot of direct applications between treating a client and driving behaviour, it is still important to have an awareness of. Of course, the major exception is unless you're supporting a client who has severe driving anxiety or driving is somehow involved in their mental health difficulties, like if they have depression after a bereavement caused by a driving accident. I think being aware of cognitive processes in driving can be useful for psychoeducation in therapy. If a client is struggling to understand the importance of our thoughts, emotions, and our mental processes, then using driving, especially if it's a passion for the client, might be a useful reframe. In addition, when thinking about this from an educational psychology viewpoint, being aware of driving cognition can be useful. One of the jobs of an educational psychologist is to create educational resources and improve student motivation as well as engagement. If I was creating psychology content, I would be linking to these real world examples that are tangible and relatable to my students. This will also allow them to see the value of their learning, as this can improve engagement too. How do social processes impact driving behaviour? Some people believe that driving is a very lonely activity, and I understand why. When I'm behind the wheel, it's just me, my overly dramatic music, and my car. I drive alone, minding my own business, and I get from point A to B. Yet in reality, driving might be one of the most socially demanding activities we do, and driving draws on a lot more social psychology than you would think, especially as whenever we go on the road, we are constantly interacting with other drivers, laws and regulations, and pedestrians. All these people and social interactions impact our driving behaviour. However, the first social process I want to draw on comes from cultural psychology. The cultural differences in our driving norms as well as behaviours are rather interesting, because what's polite and acceptable in one country can be deeply offensive and dangerous in another country. I remember a few years ago, me and my former best friend were talking about the difference between flashing your lights in the UK and France. In the UK, we flash our headlights at people to thank them or to tell them that they can come through, and we're happy to wait for them. Yet in France, if you flash your headlights, you're telling the other driver that you're coming through. Another personal example is back in 2007, and my family went to Florida for Christmas in Disneyland. My dad got a rental, and we didn't know that in the US, there's a driving rule that goes as something along the lines of, if a traffic light is red, you can still turn right. So my dad was waiting because the light was red, and all the Americans behind him were honking, getting frustrated and annoyed that he was just sitting there. It's a good example of how waiting at a red light is acceptable in the UK, but in the US, it isn't acceptable when you can turn right. On the whole, the cultural nuances of driving help to show the social nature of driving and why you need to understand the local norms when driving in a new place. Another social process involved in driving is our social identity, because everything down to the car we drive, our car accessories, and our driving style are all expressions of our social identity. As well as for some drivers, they see their vehicle as an extension of their personality, and this can lead to more performative and aggressive driving. My mind goes towards an old family friend who put things on his exhaust to make his car louder, and he would rev his engine so everyone would know he had an expensive, showy car. As you can tell, I know next to nothing about cars and the names of their equipment that makes them louder. But some people are somewhat desperate to show off their status, money, and their car by making it as loud as possible, so it draws attention. Whereas for me, my car definitely reflects my more laid back and maybe practical approach to life. I enjoy that my car is small, affordable, and about 12 years old. I don't want a massive status car. I don't want the latest expensive model. And I certainly don't want something overly complicated. I honestly just want something practical, reliable, and gets me from point A to B. And affordability is a good point as well. The penultimate social process involved in driving is obedience and conformity. I'll be the first to admit that it seems whenever social psychology is mentioned, obedience and conformity are never too far behind. And this is even more true for driving, because as drivers, we need to conform to traffic laws, regulations, and the highway code, since we're more likely to follow these rules when we see other people follow these rules too. Yet we are more willing to break these rules when we see others breaking them. This is why understanding the role of social influence is critical when we look at the psychology behind driving and safety. Personally, I always try to be conscious of my speed, my driving, and how I'm impacting others. Of course, I'm human, I make mistakes, and on occasion I've sped, yet I always remain mindful of sticking to the speed limit and other rules, even when it annoys other drivers. It's good to know that by sticking to the rules myself, I might be influencing other people to drive safely too. Finally, intergroup dynamics is a major role in driving, and this is even more true if you have passengers in the car, since peer pressure can influence our driving, and sometimes this is for the worse. For instance, young drivers are more likely to engage in risky behaviours when they're driving their friends. I remember a few years ago in the news in the UK, the government was thinking about banning new drivers from driving passengers for the first year after they passed their test because of an increase in deaths of passengers in new drivers' cars. It was something like that. It never happened, but it shows how driving with our friends can be fatal. Personally, I do notice I drive differently depending on who's in the car with me. When I was driving my exes round, I was always extra careful. I made sure I made as few mistakes as possible, and I was the best driver I could be. I wanted them to feel relaxed, good, and I wanted them to enjoy driving with me. Whereas when I'm by myself, I am still the safest possible driver I can be, but I am less militant about it. On the other hand, I have no problem making myself look bad here, because as a teenager, learning to drive, I was a terrible passenger. I would gently point out the mistakes until my parents lovingly told me to shut up. It's another example how people's opinions or being annoying could have a potential impact on our driving. How do external factors impact driving behaviour? Before we dive into the role of personality and individual differences in the driving, I want to explore the role that our environment and external factors have on our driving behaviour, since the world around us impacts our behaviours without us realising. For instance, the weather impacts driving behaviour because a bright sunlight, fog, snow, and rain can increase our stress levels and changes our risk perception. Since some drivers become overly cautious when the weather turns bad, and other drivers do not change the driving to match the weather condition. I fully admit that this is something I need to get better at, because I do slightly change my driving to the weather, but I feel like I should be doing more. Granted, if it's raining badly, then I don't really allow myself to go over 60 miles per hour on the motorway instead of my normal 70 miles per hour. This is something I need to work on. Therefore, this shows how understanding the weather affects our mental state and our driving behaviour. In other words, please adjust your driving to the conditions. Your driving will hopefully be safer. Another external factor that impacts driving behaviour is time pressure. We've all been in situations where we've been running late for something, we've been feeling anxious and stressed, and even though this is a perfectly normal response, it can and does increase the likelihood that we would take risks on the road, make poor decisions, and drive more aggressively. This highlights the importance of monitoring our emotions and how they will impact our driving, giving ourselves plenty of time for journeys, but also just take a breath. I understand how annoying, frustrating, and how much you might want to swear when you suddenly get stuck in traffic on the way to something important. Definitely swear as a way to release your frustration, but also take a breath, untense your body, and focus on safe driving. In the longer term, you'll be more grateful for arriving late than injured. Your car got written off, or worse. A penultimate external factor that impacts driving behaviour is technology, because technology is constantly changing how we interact with the road and our vehicles. For example, GPS, the advanced safety features, and reversing cameras are all common in modern cars. My car is old enough that it doesn't have any of these features, and as an interesting side note, I was watching a crime drama once, and a computer hacker mentioned how cars built after 2010 were just a hack waiting to happen. Of course, I do not know if it's true because it was a crime drama, so fiction, but it highlights how advanced the technology in our cars has become. In terms of psychology, increased use of technology in our vehicles can reduce cognitive load and improve road safety, yet technology can also lead to distraction and over-reliance. This might decrease safety. Personally, this is why I am a little curious and unsure about using mobile phones as GPSs. I used to always use a sat-nav religiously as my GPS because I didn't want to use my phone. When I was using this, there were no real distractions, but then my sat-nav broke. I switched to my phone as a GPS, and it is amazing how tempting it is to look at emails, change your music, and look at notifications when you're stuck in traffic or driving along on a calm road. I might have done this once, but then I reminded myself how dangerous forming that habit would be. Yet it is so easy to fall into that trap when driving. The final environmental factor that impacts driving behaviour is the design of our roads and infrastructure. Because if roads are well designed, clearly signed, and they have a logical traffic flow, then this can reduce stress and increase safe driving. Whereas poorly designed intersections and confusing road layouts then lead to driving errors, frustration, and decreased safe driving. Tapping into the real world, we've all seen drivers that have changed lanes coming up to a turning or roundabout indicated at the last moment, and perhaps made a poor decision to get into the correct lane because they don't know the correct layout of the road. I made this mistake a few years ago near where I lived because in the UK, coming up to a roundabout, the left-hand lane is for turning left or going straight ahead at the roundabout. The other or right-hand lane is for going right, yet near where I live, if you want to go straight ahead, you have to go in the right-hand lane, which is very confusing and difficult when the right-hand lane is full of traffic. because everyone thinks you're turning left. It's an innocent mistake, but it can show how easily this can happen in the real world. And on a busy roundabout with a lot of tense, stressed, and frustrated drivers, I can see how this leads to a decrease in safe driving. How do personality factors impact driving behaviour? The final area of behaviour that we need to look at is our personality and individual differences impact our driving, because no two drivers are the same. I think you only need to look at families to see the differences in drivers. I would protest that I am a great driver, but my parents think that I brake too early. My defense is braking slower and for longer improves fuel economy. I would argue that some people in my family should indicate more, but they are a great driver. This goes to show differences between drivers. Therefore, if we look at the big five personality traits, we can see the impact these have on driving. For example, extroversion relates to how outgoing you are, and introversion focuses on how you need your own company to recharge your social battery. I tend to remember introversion as you get energy from being alone, and extroversion is when you get energy from being around others. This is not a personality psychology podcast episode, so that is the extent of the definition I will give. Anyway, people higher in extroversion might be more likely to engage in sensation seeking behaviours whilst driving. For example, extroverted people are naturally more likely to take risks like speeding, weaving in between traffic, and tailgating. To me, there is nothing more annoying than people weaving through traffic and cutting in way too close for comfort. So, a person's likelihood to take risks is influenced by their personality traits and past experiences. Building upon this, sensation seeking behaviour has a strong connection to speeding and risk taking, because risk takers could see the road as their own personal racetrack, so they push the limits of speed and safety in pursuit of their own excitement. Of course, this is dangerous to themselves, their friends, and other road users. I hope I never forget this moment, but I was working an open evening event years ago, and it was a great night. But I was stuck with a very rich student. We clearly came from very different backgrounds, because his student apartment had private parking in a gated driveway, induction hobs, and more advanced features that most students could only dream of. His opinion was, "It's okay, it's not bad. I would love to have those things as a student." Anyway, he was telling me how he drove down a high-speed road near the university at 140 miles per hour for fun. Not only is that very illegal, because the speed limit was 70 miles per hour, but there are cameras, and that is dangerous to his life, his passenger's life, and the other cars on the road. It was such a shocking moment that I was just surprised at. If we look at conscientiousness, individuals high in this personality trait tend to be more cautious drivers, as well as rule-abiding people. For example, conscientious drivers tend to be more organised, attentive to details, as well as responsible compared to drivers lower in the personality trait. This means they tend to make safer drivers because they are more likely to maintain their vehicle properly, follow traffic rules, and avoid risky behaviours. Conclusion. When I originally planned this podcast episode, I didn't really know what I was going to find about the psychology of driving. At best, I thought I was going to find a lot of pop psychology articles and opinions, and at worst, I thought I would find nothing at all. Yet, a lot of brilliant researchers, writers, and other people have created a wealth of information on what impacts our driving behaviour over the years. So I am very grateful, not only because it makes my life as a writer easier, but also because I got to learn a lot of fascinating pieces of information. We learned about how our cognitive processes help us navigate the road. Our emotions can make our driving safer or more dangerous, how our personality can endanger ourselves on the road by impacting our choices, and how our social interactions on the road can help us to obey or break traffic laws, amongst other findings. This has been a fascinating episode. I would like to wrap up the episode by focusing on the 3 most important factors that I believe we can take away from this episode and apply to our own lives. Hopefully, these 3 factors will help us to become safer or even safer drivers. Learn self-soothing techniques to help you de-stress when driving, so your negative emotions do not make your driving unsafe. I talk more about self-soothing in my book, Healing as a Survivor. Check in with your emotions before and during your drive, so you can de-stress if needed to help you keep you and your passengers safe. Think about your personality. Consider how it impacts your driving and try to accommodate for your personality traits if needed. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, driving is very freeing, is brilliant, and it can be a real confidence boost, yet it has to be done safely, so you can protect yourself, your passengers, and everyone else using the road. Hi everyone, so Human and Me again. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. Like I know that I did, because it was really fascinating, to be honest, to look at the different cognitive, social and personality psychology factors behind driving. Because let's face it, when I get in the car, I just drive from point A to point B. I do not think about the psychology. I do not think about going on autopilot, road rage, and I tend to be very relaxed at driving. Of course, every so often I think, oh, that's a bit weird, like, why did you do that? Or, personally, I wouldn't have done that. But I make sure I don't get angry, because I want to be a safer driver, and I want to be considerate to other road users, which I didn't actually interpret as a social interaction or an interpersonal process, but it really is. And that's why this podcast episode was so much fun. So I really hope that you got something out of it. If you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, definitely check out Personality, Psychology, and Individual Differences. It's an amazing book available in all the usual places. And if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can buymeacoffee.com/Conor Whiteley. Or if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis, then you can also do that at patreon.com/The Psychology World Podcast, and you get a whole bunch of rewards for doing so. And finally, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So please feel free to contact me and reach out in all the normal ways. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwhiteley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.